In the late 1800s, along a quiet stretch of the Great Osage Trail in Kansas, stood a small wooden cabin. It looked like any other home in the frontier, a place where travelers could rest, share a warm meal, and continue their journey west. But what happened inside this cabin was anything but ordinary. This was the home of the Bender family, a group that would become infamous across America. On the surface, they appeared to be a typical frontier family. But behind their kind smiles and welcoming demeanor, they were hiding a dark and horrifying secret. Travelers who stopped here often vanished without a trace, leaving behind only whispers and questions. What really happened inside that cabin? And who were the Benders, the family that became known as the Bloody Benders? This is a story of mystery, betrayal, and unspeakable terror. To begin this story, I will first need to set up a bit of background. The Bender family lived in a very rural area known as Labette County, Kansas. They had been a part of the movement of families to the west in the New World. The family consisted of Father John Bender, 60, his wife Elvira Bender, 55, his daughter Kate Bender, 23, and his son John Bender Jr., 25. There are a few details that seem to be a bit shrouded in doubt about the family composition, though. Some reports say that John Bender Jr. and Kate Bender were siblings, and others say neighbors reported them as being married. From what I could find, there is nothing confirming this marriage, which makes others speculate it could have been a common law marriage, which would have been undocumented. This is, of course, only if they were married, though, which we could really lean either way at this point. There seems to be endless folklore and legend surrounding the Bender family. So it is hard to separate the fact from fiction. In this write-up, I will do my best to give you the most accurate and straightforward depiction of what is claimed to have happened. Sometime in October 1870, 5 families of spiritualists settled in and around the small township of Osage, roughly 7 miles or so from what is now known as the city of Cherryvale, which was established some 7 months after Osage. One of these 5 families included the Benders. They had registered 165 acres of land right beside the Great Osage Trail, which at the time was the only open road leading to the west at the time. The family got to work rather quickly building a cabin, a barn with a horse corral, and a well for water. The following year in 1871, Elvira and Kate arrived, and the cabin was turned into a dual space. They cut the room in half with a wagon cover, using the front half of the cabin as a general store, selling a few dry goods. Among these goods were oats and other grains. The front was also used as a kitchen, where the family would cook for travelers and even spend the night. The family had planted and tended to a rather sizable 2-acre vegetable garden, and also planted an apple orchard. Needless to say, the Benders had created somewhat of an oasis in the middle of nowhere, or so it would seem to the naked eye. Here's where things get really strange and slightly confusing. The family itself has literally no documentation, it seems. Where they came from has been up for debate for decades. The most popular theory is they were from Germany, but other reports claim the Netherlands could be their origin. John Bender was an older man at the time, being 60 years old and speaking very little English made it hard for him to adapt and communicate. When John did speak, though, it was described as being guttural, and more often than not, unintelligible. John also went by the name of William, according to the Emporia News. Reports get a bit muddy about John. Some sources report John Bender isn't even his real name, but it is actually John Flickinger. Now, I can't find any solid sources on this claim, so I would take it with a grain of salt. Elvira Bender is where reports get even muddier, but creepy as hell. Elvira apparently didn't speak fluent English either, but was better spoken than her husband. Elvira seemed to have a reputation of not being the nicest person, though, even being referred to as a she-devil by their neighbors. According to some old newspapers I found, Elvira was apparently actually born Almira Hill Mark in the Adirondack Mountains. She apparently married a man named Simon Mark, with who she had a whopping 12 children. She would go on to marry another man named William Griffith, and apparently many other men who she would go on to kill. Rumors say she killed multiple husbands. None of this is confirmed to my knowledge, though. John Bender Jr. spoke fluent English, but had what much thought to be a German accent. Apparently, John Jr. was known to break out into a burst of aimless laughter at various times, leading many locals to think he may not have been all there. Kate Bender was a very attractive young woman. She spoke perfect English with little to no accent. Kate was a self-proclaimed healer and psychic and would pass out flyers promoting her services. She claimed to have the power to cure illness, conduct seances, and taught spiritualism. Kate had gained a lot of popularity in the area. While her parents would stay away from people, her and John Jr. would often attend Sunday services at the church and be seen in town. Locals are reported to have quoted Kate as promoting free love, which sounded a lot more like incest to me. A quote from Kate's lectures, "Shall we confine ourselves to a single love and deny our natures their proper sway? Even though it be a brother's passion for his own sister, I say it should not be smothered." Many speculate that John and Kate were not actually siblings, but a married couple. This is where I will end my look into the questionable background of the Bender family. Now, I will begin the truly disgusting events that took place on the Bender property. In May 1871, the first of many bodies would be discovered. The body of a man simply known as Jones was found with his skull crushed in and his throat cut. He was found in Drum Creek. Initially, people suspected the owner of the creek, but it seems no action was taken. About a year later, in February 1872, 2 more bodies of unidentified men had been found with nearly identical wounds. By the following year, in 1873, reports of missing people who had been traveling through the area had become so common that people were beginning to avoid the trail entirely. It didn't help that the area was already known for horse thieves and other villains. Oftentimes, officials would arrest someone for the crimes but would let them go not too long after. It is said many innocent people were driven out of the area by these suspicions. This unsolved spree of killings would not last forever, though. In the winter of 1872, 2 travelers are known as George Newton Longcore and his infant daughter Mary Ann left the town of Independence in Kansas. Their goal was to move to Iowa and start a new life. Sadly, they would never be heard from again. In the spring of 1873, esteemed Dr. William Henry York set off to look for the missing man and his child. Dr. York was a neighbor of the 2 and had questioned many homesteaders who lived along the trail he had known them to take. Dr. York looked far and wide and eventually made it to Fort Scott. The doctor began his journey back home on March 9th, but like many before him, he would never return or be heard from again. This is where the gruesome story of what happened to all of these people would begin to come to light. Dr. York had 2 brothers, both of whom had prominence at the time. Alexander York was a member of the Kansas State Senate, and Colonel Ed York was an esteemed military officer. Both of Dr. York's brothers were aware of his travel plans, and when he failed to return home, an all-out search began for the missing doctor. Ed York would lead a search part of 50 or so men. They questioned every traveler they came across on the trail and visited every homestead they could locate. Finally, on March 28, 1873, Ed York and his search party had arrived at the Bender family inn. Ed had explained to the Benders that his brother had gone missing and had asked if any of them had potentially seen anything. Oddly, the Benders admitted to seeing Dr. York and even said he had stayed with them. They claimed he had left and potentially had issues with Native Americans. Ed had agreed this could be a possible explanation and even stayed for dinner. This would seem to be a close call for the Benders. Their arrogance would begin to display in this time is likely what ended their reign of terror. On April 3rd, Ed York would return to the Bender Inn with armed men when a woman fled from the inn and claimed Elvira threatened her with knives. Elvira played the no-speak English card, and her children denied the claim adamantly. When York doubled down on his claims, Elvira apparently became full of rage and said the woman was a witch and had tried to curse her coffee. She then made the men leave, which for the first time truly showed her understanding of the English language, which was reportedly much better than she let on. As York was leaving, Kate asked him to return alone the following Friday night, and she would use her clairvoyant abilities to help him find his brother. The men in York's search party were entirely convinced the Benders and a family close by known as the Roaches were guilty and wanted to hang them all, but York insisted that evidence must be found first. It would be a real shame to hang innocent people. At the same time, communities around the Osage area began to point fingers at each other. A meeting was held by the township in the local schoolhouse. Upwards of 75 locals attended the meeting, including Ed York, John Bender, and John Jr. After the announcement and discussion of the disappearances, including that of Dr. York, it was mutually agreed a search warrant would be obtained to search every homestead between Big Hill Creek and Drum Creek. Despite Ed York's strong suspicions toward the Bender family since his visit weeks earlier, no one had seemingly thought to watch them, and it was not noticed for several days that they had fled the Osage area. About 3 days after the township meeting, Billy Toll was driving cattle past the Bender property. He noticed the inn was abandoned and the animals were left unfed. Billy would notify the township trustee, who would not have the chance to investigate the property for a few days due to poor weather. The township trustee would call for volunteers, where several hundred turned out to form a search party that included Ed York himself. When the party arrived at the inn, they found the cabin was empty and devoid of food, clothing, and personal possessions. It was as if the Bender family had never existed. A horrid odor was coming from the floor under the cabin. After moving the bed, they found a trap door with an empty room underneath. The door was nailed shut, and after being opened, the search party discovered a 6-foot by 7-foot room with clotted blood on the floor. The stone slab floor was smashed up by a sledgehammer, and no bodies were found in the room. The smell was assumed to be blood that was soaked on the floor and dirt. The men even lifted the cabin, and dug underneath to search for bodies. No bodies were found under the house, but the Benders' murderous secret would not stay hidden for long. The search party began to probe the ground all around the cabin, and eventually came across the vegetable garden, which seemed to have been recently disturbed. Dr. York's body was found that evening, buried face down with his feet barely under the dirt. The probing continued into the night, where upwards of 9 more graves were found. Another body was found in the well alongside various body parts, which is hard to say if they belonged to the existing victims or new ones. All but one victim had their heads smashed in and their throats cut. According to newspapers at the time, all the victims had been brutally mutilated. A body of a young girl was also found, but no injuries could be determined. It is thought she may have been strangled or buried alive. To show my respect to these victims, I will list out the known suspected names of the victims, as well as a quick rundown of the apparent timeline of murders. Mr. Jones. His body was found in May 1871 in Drum Creek. His skull was crushed and throat cut. 2 unidentified men. Bodies were found in February 1872. Their skulls were crushed and throats cut. Ben Brown, found buried in the Bender's apple orchard. He died sometime in 1872 and had the same injuries as the rest of the victims. W.F. McCrotty went missing in 1872 with his wagon and horses. His body was found buried in the orchard. Henry Mackenzie went missing in December 1872 with his horses. Johnny Boyle was reported missing in December 1872. His horse and expensive gear went too. His body was found in the Bender's well. George Newton Longcore and Mary Ann. George and his 18-month-old daughter were found in December 1872 as well. Dr. William York. After seeking out answers for George and Mary Ann, Dr. York went missing in May 1873. He was found in the apple orchard. John Greery. His body was found in the orchard, and his time of death is unknown. Unidentified male, remains found in the orchard. Further details are unknown. Unidentified female, also found in the orchard. Much as the last, info is scarce. Various body parts. Many body parts were found as well. None of them seemingly belonged to the existing bodies. It is believed there could be up to 3 more victims that belong to these parts. 4 unidentified men. During the search party found the bodies of 4 more men in Drum Creek. Their throats were cut and skulls crushed. One of the men could be Jack Bogart, whose horse was sold to a friend of Jack's by the Benders. Ultimately, the death toll is thought to be around 20 or so. Aside from a few, most of the bodies were never claimed and were reburied at the bottom of a hill roughly 1 mile away from the Bender home. This area is now known as the Bender Mounds. After searching the cabin further, 3 hammers were recovered: a shoe hammer, a claw hammer, and a sledgehammer, all of which matched the wounds on the victims. The hammers were displayed in a Bender Murder Museum from 1967 to 1978 in Cherryvale in Kansas. You can still see the hammers, though they are displayed in a nice display at the Cherryvale Museum. A knife was apparently found as well, hidden within a mantel clock. It was a 4-inch blade and can be seen by request in the museum. It still shows the blood on the blade. This next part is a fairly sad but accurate representation of just how barbaric our early form of justice was. A friend of the Bender family, a man named Brockman, was accused of knowing information about the killings. He was hung from a beam in the barn until unconscious, and then he was revived and roughly interrogated to spill any information he knew. Then he was hung again. After being hung 3 times until nearly dead, he was released and was described as staggering home as if he was drunk or deranged. I mean, after being nearly killed 3 times, I bet we all would be a bit off balance and frantic. A Roman Catholic prayer book was found within the home, with various notes written inside. The text read, Johanna Bender. Born July 30th, 1848, John Gebhardt came to America on July 1st, 1888, Big Slaughter Day, January 8th, and Hell departed. Most are still unsure what these meant, but it is assumed they were some sort of cipher or schedule. Now, what happened to the Bloody Benders? Did they really escape and vanish into the sunset? Well, not quite, at least according to the reports that are out there. Detectives are said to have followed wagon tracks from the Bender's wagon and found it abandoned outside the city limits of a place called Thayer. Thayer was a roughly 12-mile journey from their home. It was confirmed that the Benders took a train from Leavenworth, Lawrence and Galveston Railroad toward Humboldt. At Chanute, John Jr. and Kate left the train and caught the MK and T train going toward the south to Red River County, near Denison, Texas. From there, it is thought they traveled to an outlaw colony located by the border region between Texas and New Mexico. They were not tracked due to how dangerous it was for lawmen to enter the region. Later on, a detective would claim he had traced the siblings to the border, where he claimed John Jr. had died of apoplexy, commonly known as a stroke. According to this detective, John and Elvira Bender had continued on north to Kansas City, where they purchased train tickets for St. Louis, Missouri. These are unconfirmed, of course, as the Bender family was never found. There were many sightings of the Bender family, as well as claims of vigilantes that killed them. Some of the notable claims were from a group of travelers who claimed to have caught the Bender family and hung them, later discarding their bodies in the Verdigris River. Another claim came from a different group that claimed they had a shootout with the Bender family and buried their bodies on the prairie. Despite all these claims and rumors, though, no one ever came forward to claim the $2,000 reward. This would be somewhere around $54,000 as of today. An interesting tidbit to add is that in 1884, it was reported that an elderly man who looked somewhat like John Bender was arrested in Montana for a murder committed near Salmon, Idaho. The victim in this attack had been killed from a blow to the head. A request for identification was sent to Cherryvale, but the man in custody severed his foot in an attempt to escape and bled out. By the time an official got to the area, the body was too far decomposed to be identified. As I mentioned earlier, John Bender may have been known as John Flickinger, and oddly enough, a man with that exact name was said to have committed suicide near Lake Michigan. Like just about everything else with this family, this is unconfirmed. The last claim I wanted to mention was that in 1889, it was reported that Elvira and Kate Bender were arrested in Niles, Michigan. I often see this misreported as Detroit in articles I have read on the subject. They were arrested for theft, but were released and found not guilty. They were arrested shortly after and were accused of being the Bender family. From what I can find, they denied the accusation strongly, but after being worn down by officials, they began making accusations that each other was the real Bender, and they were but an innocent bystander. Eventually, the two would be put on trial, and evidence proved the woman claimed to be Kate was in fact married in Michigan at the time of the murders. An affidavit produced by a daughter of the woman accused of being Elvira would show she was married to a completely different man with an entirely different family. Though many still believe this truly was Elvira Bender, though. With a lack of evidence against the two women, they were released and never charged. Many people still doubt their identification as Benders. At the end of the day, no one really knows what happened to the Bloody Benders, America's first serial killing family. I truly wonder what would drive a group of people to want to kill so mercilessly. It just seems so violent for seemingly little reward. Maybe they were truly the devils they were thought to be by locals. When I found this case the other day, I knew I had to cover it. It's not every day you find a piece of history like this that truly shows just how different our world was not that long ago.